I want to ask first, there's this movement in America that we're interested in, where there's a whole sort of break-off group of conservatives who are quite strongly anti-big business. And they think that the whole kind of settlement of the last 30 years, the so-called neoliberal stuff, has gone too far in favour of business, and that true conservatives should actually be pushing back against that. Do you think that is a dividing line in the UK as well?
I think it's something we're getting towards, and I think, look, I'm a conservative because I believe in the individual. I believe in, as much as possible, your ability to take your own decisions, to shape your own environment, to live in your own community with your own family in the ways that you choose. I'm against state intervention, as with obvious exceptions, and the same applies actually to big business, and I think that's where the American trend is coming from. Many of us recognise that Thatcher's reforms of the state monopolies in the 70s, 80s that carried through a bit into the 90s were hugely important, not just for liberalising the UK, for freeing people, but also actually in terms of distributing wealth as well. I mean, one forgets that one of the greatest redistributions of wealth in UK history was the sale of the council houses. Yeah. When wealth went from the state to people who had been paying the state for 20, 30, 40 years in terms of rent, and they suddenly had control of their own assets. And that was a hugely important moment.
Do you feel that that arc that started sort of has now gone too far?
Well, not in terms of the state, no. I mean, I think we should always be pushing back the boundaries of the state. But I do think that there are boundaries in the private sector too, and you can look at capitalism today, and I'm a fervent capitalist, and you can say, hang on a minute, some of the things that we're seeing today are not capitalists, they're monopolists. We're looking at some of the companies that we deal with, even in the UK, where effectively there's two or three, and it's an oligopoly effectively, where there's two or three companies that really do market dominate to such an extent that actually competition is nigh on impossible. And that's where I think the state also has a role, because actually the role of the state is not to be a player, but to be an adjudicator. To
set the rules.
To set the rules.
So do you think, if you look at the Parliamentary Conservative Party, do you think that is a live discussion? Do you think there is, between the kind of libertarian sort of free market is always the answer group and the kind of, no, there are other things we should be prioritising over that? Is that, we never hear about that really. Is that
Well, there's one issue that's rather dominating everything else. And
yeah.
so, I mean, I think it's, the problem with the one issue is it drowns out so much real conversation about conservatism. But, I mean, I'm very much part of the gang that would argue very strongly that, look, of course companies must be able to succeed, but that doesn't mean that companies must operate the palm tree policy of strangling all new competition. When we look at, for example, some of the tech billionaire, the tech unicorns, and the way that they use their market capital to entirely,
monopolise.
Well, and not just to monopolise, but actually to leave founders of potential rivals with simply no choice but to sell, because their valuations are so completely absurd and based on equity ratios.
You would have government intervene in some way, or regulations change to make.
Well,
that
I think this is where one's got to look at the Competition and Monopolies Authority and ask yourself, what's a monopoly? Because if you're looking at, for example, a classic one is Google's purchase of DeepMind. That is an incredible overreach now. And actually, I would argue there's national security elements in that too. But sadly, that boat has sailed. But there are other areas we should be looking at and thinking really hard about what does it mean to be competitive today. And it clearly doesn't mean the same as to be competitive, 40, 50 years ago.
There's the kind of anti-monopoly thing, I would say at this point, is uncontroversial, probably across the left and the right. I think almost everyone now agrees something needs to be done on that. I guess what I think is the harder distinction is the vocabulary, and whether you would say that we've actually become too materialistic, and that the system has sort of encouraged the pursuit of wealth beyond everything else too much, and that even government and politics needs to start changing the way we talk about what we're aiming for.
Well, I think
to get into that
mushy. I think that's one of the areas that Roger Scruton speaks really well about. If you listen to Roger talking about housing, for example, and the need for beauty, I mean, it sounds like he's talking about something optional and extra. It's certainly not optional and extra. You know, the nature of beauty in our society, the nature of the way that we live together in communities, the nature of the way we interact, not just with our built environment, but with each other, is all intertwined. And you can look at, the brutalism of the 50s and 60s in around the world, in places like Syria, and see the loss of values leading to failures in community. You can see the same in the UK. You know, this is not. You don't have to be me to say that. I mean, plenty of people observe this, and I think the state's role is also to encourage things that the community sees as beneficial, and not just what an individual within the community sees as financially prosperous.